I wanted to make one point about the argument that I made in the origins of the neutral theory paper. In Dick's book, which was the thing that got me started on this.
That's not my book. That's
Or not his Moto's book, yes. It could be. I differentiated two basic kind of claims that he made. One was what I called the historical thesis, which was the thesis about the neutral theory being basically neoclassical. And the other one was what I called an ideological thesis. And the ideological thesis never got published. And I think it's worth coming back to, because in the 74 book, in addition to the argument about the actual historical trajectory, you propose a mechanism for why this controversy didn't resolve. And you say it didn't resolve because it was ideologically driven. In other words, it couldn't stop. It had to be transformed from classical balance to neutralist selectionist, because there were fundamentally opposed ideologies of stability and change that characterized the classical and the balanced schools. And I think that was a very interesting comment, and one that people like Crow profoundly disagreed with.
Because he was the object of that
In
remark.
part because he was the object, but in part because he also had a critique of how could you say that a group as diverse as the neutralists, nationally, ethnically, had a shared ideology about change, right? And so I set for myself the task of trying to actually track out the individual ideologies, and sure enough, they're pretty diverse lot of people, and it was very difficult to find that subtle evidence.
Could I make a remark about that?
Yes.
There is another case where you have to distinguish between origin and development. My claim is that the origin of Kimuraism is Jim Crow.
Okay.
Look, Moto wrote, a glowing encomium of my years with Jim Crow.
Oh, yeah,
and so on and so.
yeah.
I think that Crow had a very powerful influence on Moto, although Moto was a mature scientist in many ways before he got his PhD, but he did go to Crow to get a PhD. I think it had a very powerful influence, and Crow, and I would claim that Crow's ideology was that nature, and that's the origin. Lots of people believe things which they got from places, and they don't know why they originated in those places, and they don't correspond to their own ideologies. I would be guilty of the most vulgar kind of historical determinism to say that every idea which is espoused by everybody reflects their own ideology. I mean, that would be foolish. I mean, there are people who do that, but nobody in this room would do that. But nevertheless, I would claim, for example, that, and I have never developed this, that there are a few seminal persons whose ideologies do have a profound influence on their work, and who then spread that work to others, who then take it up for other reasons, but it stems originally from ideological commitments of the originators. Dubzhansky, for example, had a very clear political ideology, and someday maybe I'll write about the relationship between that and his view of variation. And he started out life, remember, quite aside from political ideology, Dubzhansky started out life collecting beetles in Central Asia before he was ever a geneticist. And he was immensely impressed with the diversity of beetles. I mean, that was the overall. But it isn't just that. It's that his whole life he was pushing what we might call a kind of super democratic and vaguely socialist ideology in every sphere in which he entered. And I think the belief that diversity was genetic diversity was the characteristic not only of populations, but that it was good, that it was the virtue. Genetic diversity for Dubzhansky was a virtue. I mean, a moral virtue, not just an observation. It was all the good people in the world were heterozygotes. I mean, his arguments with I didn't make that up. His arguments with Muller. Muller said the smartest people are homozygotes for the geniuses. And Dubzhansky said, no, the geniuses are precisely those who are heterozygotes. So it was a deep ideological issue for Dubzhansky. And the fact that many people in his laboratory may not have shared that ideology, but shared Dubzhansky's view is simply the power of the charisma of Dubzhansky. I would say, by the way, on this point, that an unusually large fraction of the students of Dubzhansky were members of the Communist Party. I don't have to name names, but they were. Or if not members of the party, damn close to it. Mm-hmm. And members of YCL and so on, despite the fact that Dubzhansky was a declared enemy of the Soviet state, and himself would never have been classified as I mean, he was a revolution. He was an October revolutionist, not a February revolutionist.
Mm. John, you wanted to
along those lines, I agree completely about the ideology of variation of Dubzhansky. I think that's why there's not this tension in Dubzhansky that you outlined. The tension you outlined is that he's so concerned with maintaining variation that he has no explanation for how you get substitution. But I think evolution for Dubzhansky was not substitution after substitution, long-term evolution. It was rather substitution of polymorphisms. So you evolve from one polymorphism to another polymorphism to another polymorphism to another one. And you don't, of course, you don't see polymorphisms when you're looking at species comparisons.
That's right.
But underneath that, I think that's what Dubzhansky thought was going on.
Sure, John, but
and that's why I would disagree with the distinction Edna makes a little bit. I think it's important to look at interest in variation rather than substitution, but I wouldn't distinguish it as static versus dynamic, because it's dynamic variation.
But John, look, let's back to a basic model of organisms in the world. This is a kind of state space of organisms, the taxonomic space that was in notion that was introduced by Evelyn Hutchinson. And our observations are that organisms are distributed as clusters in taxonomic space. Right? I mean, that's the way. And there are clusters of clusters and clusters of clusters of clusters, and so they clearly have a really. And the problematic for me for evolution is how do you explain the empty places? But that's another issue. Now, you're quite right that for Dubzhansky, evolution meant, if you like, a movement of that cluster. Sometimes it meant a splitting of a cluster into two clusters. And sometimes it meant a movement of the cluster in the space. But to describe it as a cluster, in some perspective, misses the point that the cluster is clustered someplace. And the problem of evolution, as often stated, is why did you start out here and get over here? So yes, it's true that it's the movement of the variation, but you still have to have a directionality to it. You still have to move the location of the cluster somehow in space a long way as compared to the variation within the cluster, otherwise you're not a species. So it's got both of those in it. Yeah. I agree that Dubzhansky wouldn't have said you move from that point to that point, but he would have said you move from that central location to that central location. And the balance theory doesn't do much for that, especially if there are new genotypes here that weren't even over there. You still have to cope with that.